Now let's start creating the very first API request. Now in order to do that, we need to create a new collection. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna click on this new collection, and we can give any name over here, maybe my first API request, right? In a description, we can give any description. This is my first API request. And then there's an authorization tab. Now this is very important. You can see lot of authorization methods available over here, right? So what authorization means, let's take an example. Let's say I have to upload an image on Facebook, but before that I need to perform a login. So in Facebook, there could be a login API, there could be a upload image API, there could be API for searching for friend list, right? There could be a number of APIs, right? Now, when you are performing a manual testing of Facebook, so first, like you cannot directly upload an image, right? First, you need to perform a login, right? So that Facebook should know that you are a valid user who is actually uploading the photograph, and the photograph is uploaded onto your account itself, right? Which is tied up with your login ID and password. Similarly, when let's say if we are doing the same stuff using the Facebook APIs, let's say if we are logging with a login API, we are uploading an image with a like upload image API, right? So here as well, you first need to like provide some authorization, right? So what happens? There are many APIs that requires authorizations, right? So when you log in, there's a session ID that is generated, and that session ID is actually provided in all your API requests, right? So once you perform login, a session ID is generated. The same session ID will be passed on to the image upload API, right? And then will be passed on to the search friend API, right? All the APIs for that particular functionality, they're actually going to share the same session ID. And before we start all this process, these APIs, they requires authorization. So whenever you are working in a real-time environment, most of the APIs will require authorization. So to make sure you are a valid user and accessing that particular API, right? Because it is obvious. I mean, without having the authorization to uploading an image onto someone else's portal, you won't be able to do anything, right? You first need to log in, means you first need to authorize that system. So till the time you are not authorized to access that API, you'll not be able to send any request or receive any response from that particular API. So as I said, there are a lot of authorization type that REST APIs support, like the API key, the basic authorization, the bearer token, Auth1, Auth2, right? There are a number of them, but the most frequently, most of them are not frequently used. What are generally used in industry are this bearer token, the basic authorization, the Auth1, Auth2, right? So we're gonna have a detailed discussion on these, and it's not important to learn like these because these are not very frequently used. So what all things are very frequently used, we are going to cover in this course in Postman as well as in Rest Assured. So in other terms, let's say if I practically talk about a login API. So let's say this is a sample login API. So in login API, like the method type, we are actually creating a new session. So the method type remains as post, and then we log in with the email and the actual password. And in revert, we're gonna get response from the API again in a form of JSON, and that JSON will gonna have something related to the session ID which is actually created, and you're gonna see a session ID, a very long key, something like this. And now after login, let's say we need to upload an image, and there is another upload image API, right? And the URL goes something like https example, the same URL that we have used over here, example.com/API/upload image. So what will be the request type, the method type over here? This will also be post, because what we are doing, we are uploading an image, right? We are creating a new record, right? So here maybe we need to provide something that is the path of the image that we are uploading. Along with that, we need to provide the session ID. So where we will get the session ID from? We'll get this session ID from the login API. So this is one form of authorization. Till the time we won't authorize this upload image API with this current session ID, then we'll not be able to upload the image. So in general terms, if we talk about all the APIs which is related in this URI, right, the session ID will remain the same for all the requests that we are sending. But again, there could be some APIs that may not need this session ID, right? Now, what are those APIs? So the very first API over here is the login API itself, right? The login API will not need the session ID. There could be other, let's say, user registration API, where we are registering a new user, right? So that is mostly done before we perform logging. So the session is not created, right? So we need not to provide any session ID over here while registering a user. We need not to provide any session ID while logging first time with that particular user, right? But yes, to use further APIs for uploading image, for searching for friend list, for doing n number of operations in that particular session, you need that particular session ID. But again, different APIs have different ways of authorization, right? So like if I talk about Facebook API or a Twitter API, then the authorization type they use is auth, right? So we'll be learning all these stuff, and in some time it will be very much clear to you. And let's say if we are talking about this authorization type, if I select any particular authorization type over here and provide this consumer key and all the secret code and access token, or maybe I just select a bearer token and provide a token over here. Now what all API request that I will be doing inside this collection will gonna share the same bearer token, the same authorization type, right? So if let's say if I've created 10 different requests inside this collection, so all the collection will by default gonna use the same bearer token, or whichever API request type that I select will gonna share the same authorization request type in this collection, right? So this can be done on the other way as well. Either you can select the authorization type at a particular request level, right, at a particular API level, or once you do it at the collection level, it will be generic to all the API requests. So as of now, we are not going to use any authorization for sending the very first request. We're going to see a very simple API to get familiar with how we're going to send a request and get the response, right? So we'll be covering these things as well in depth. Now the next tab that we're going to see is pre-request scripts. So pre-request scripts are basically written in Postman in JavaScript. So what are prerequisite scripts? These are something related to, let's say, if you may have ever worked on TestNG, although we are going to cover TestNG as well in this course, but you may have worked on Selenium and may have used any other API or an automation tool where there are some prerequisites. Let's say if I talk about TestNG itself, there are some annotations like @test, before test, before class, before suit, right? So @test, it converts your existing code into test cases. But before you execute @test, we may want to launch a browser, we may want to configure some logs or configure some Excel files. So we may provide it in @before test or @before suit. So before we execute our test, we need to perform some task. So that is what is done in prerequisite scripts in case of the REST APIs over here. So we're going to have a discussion around this. We're going to look at this in our upcoming lecture as well. And then we have a test tab over here where we can add our test cases, add validations, assertions, right? We're gonna validate what is our expected data and what is our actual result that we are getting. We're gonna compare it. We're gonna check the pass and fail, right? So these are the things that we can do and we'll be looking at once we start adding validations. And then we have variables where we can create some variables some variables which will be accessible inside your collections, right? So what all things that we are doing over here: authorization, prerequisite scripts, test, validations, variables, all these things will be applicable to what all requests that we are sending inside this collection, right? Although we can adjust them at the request level as well, but this is global. I mean, if you're doing it over here, you need not to worry whether a particular API you need to set the variables or set the validation or set the authorization separately, right? So this will going to save a lot of our time when we are sending a particular request, right? When we're using a particular API. So we're going to have a detailed discussion around this. So in the next few sessions, we're going to familiarize with these concepts a lot before we actually get our hands dirty with the coding part, right? We'll first be familiarized with the API testing world, right? All the terminology that are being used while doing API testing, right? And then we'll jump on to the coding part. Thank you.